Welcome to Italics, television for the Italian American experience. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. Last month, the City University of New York held its 5th biennial conference on diversity and inclusion entitled The Power of an Anti-Racist Academy, Reimagining Systems and Structures. Professors Donna Chirico, Fred Gardaphé, and myself participated in the conference with a session we organized entitled, What Do You Mean I'm Funny? Humor is Microaggression in the Italian American Community. On this month's episode, we share with you some of the highlights from our session. Buon ascolto.
Americans were laughing at Italians before they were laughing with them. Like all new immigrants, Italians were the targets of American humor, first out of the fear of their difference, and then out of the familiarity with their peculiarities. Some scholars have attributed this to the idea that making fun of a minority is just part of the process by which that minority is incorporated into the identity mosaic of the United States. In one of the earliest studies of American humor, Constance Rourke noted that there is a progression in the incorporation of diverse identities into the body of American identity. And much of this incorporation came just after the Civil War, a time when the question of just what was an American and who could be an American was challenged as never before. Writing in the late 1920s, Rourke identified what she thought would be a pattern in the production and consumption of humor in the United States. And this is from Rourke. The Jew is moving out of caricature into the realm of the humanized drawing, on the stage and in the narrative. After a long submergence, the Negro has come into a broad portrayal. The change seems all but inevitable. It has occurred in literature before. A figure enters as comic, then gradually, when the full light is cast upon him, human lineaments begin to appear, and he is included in a larger realization. It would be a long time before the Italian would become part of what Rourke called the, quote, rounded completion of an American type. Italians become a regular subject of humor in the United States as early as the 19th century, when the largest immigration of peoples to the US were Italians fleeing the recently created nation in search of possibilities for better lives. This migration from Italy would prove to be one of the largest in world history and would be reacted to through depictions in American media that forged distorted images of just what these Italians were and what they were doing here. Their arrival was greeted with suspicion by those who called themselves natives, those who had immigrated from Great Britain only a few generations earlier, long enough, I suppose, to fashion themselves as Native Americans. The humor that ensued was literally based on ignorance, a not knowing about the culture and social conditions that had shaped these new arrivals. This ignorance fostered a suspicion that led to a fear of the unknown and foreign. As barbed humor, sharped and pointed in the direction of the Italians, made its way into social discourse, newspaper and magazines were quick to accompany articles with derogatory cartoons. This type of cartoon helped foster anti-immigrant sentiments. The Wasp, a primarily satirical publication, directed its sting towards the immigrant question, offering the suggestion through such cartoons that the US needed to consider ways of keeping out what many saw as dangerous foreign elements. Similar characterizations of newly arrived immigrants from Southern Europe appeared regularly in publications throughout the United States, resulting in the creation of a horrible image of Italians that led to fear, especially in those who would never happen to encounter such immigrants. It is in these cartoons that we see the beginning of the shaping of stereotypes that would be associated with Americans for a long time. In the cartoon, the super American holds immigrants from Italy and China in his hands as though he has apprehended them, keeping them from stepping onto American soil. Stuffed in his pockets are legislative bills designed to restrict immigration. While this might be seen as folklore by now, it represents the early development of a dark humor directed toward American ethnics, portraying them as strangers in old world dress and sending the message that they were not worthy of citizenship and therefore not welcome in the United States. As the US was struggling to establish its own identity in relationship to the rest of the world, especially Europe, what was and could be American would become of prime importance to the relatively young country. Making Americans would become a major focal point for social and political action during the historical period known as the Progressive Era from around 1880 to 1920, a time of industrialization and the largest period of immigration in the nation's history. Progressive era reforms were designed to combat the social problems caused by the industrialization of production, the urbanization of the US population, mass immigration, and the growing corruption of local and national governments. This period of US history was the height of Italian immigration, and those Italian immigrants faced their share of abuse in nearly all social endeavors that progressives sought to change. While many Italians benefited from the reforms in labor, education, and politics, they also suffered from the backlash as they were often characterized as part of the problems that needed to be solved. The idea of the melting pot as a metaphor for how immigrants would become Americans, which came from the title of Israel Zengel's 1908 play about Russian Jewish immigrants, became the lens through which reformists focused their activism. It wouldn't be long before the idea of Americanization was picked up in humor. It was more often than not done in ways that set up native-born Americans as superior to the new immigrants, and subsequent humor would be based on this superiority theory. Considered to be the earliest theory dating back to Plato and Aristotle, this theory states that people laugh at the misfortune of others because of the joy we feel at being their superiors, a way of separating them from us. This would be a crucial factor in establishing American identity, and this was a time when the US was striving to do just that. As critic John Lowe reminds us, quote, ethnic humor has always formed part of the world of American folklore and culture, partly because it provides pleasure and partly because of its connection with mythical concepts of aggression, struggle, and our national passion play and ritual, Americanization. Humor then would be a key way of signaling what was and wasn't American. Back in 1899, Puck magazine published a cartoon by J.S. Pugh that literally depicted the split loyalties projected onto new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. As the cartoon shows, real Americans should not preserve any of their ancestral cultural identities as they make their way to and into American society. And those who did should not have been given the right to vote. In 1903, Judge Magazine, a satirical publication supported by the Republican Party, depicted immigration from Europe as an infestation, threatening law and order, and equated it with potential violence and murder. President McKinley, pictured in Uncle Sam's thought cloud, had been assassinated in 1901 by Leon Szoslow, a US-born son of Polish immigrants who had lost his job and who had become an anarchist. By depicting Italians and other Southern European immigrants as vermin, this and many other publications began to shape the way Italians would be seen for a long time, often making fun of the work that Italian immigrants did in order to survive. This one's called Regarding the Italian Population. It shows them, inside of a room, all crowded, drinking, fighting, and what should be done with them is that they should be herded together and drowned. The Italian stereotype was there from the very beginning of the first arrival of Italians to the United States, and it remains today, and it remains just as problematic as a lot of other stereotypical depictions that create hate and fear.
So why do educational settings fail in creating authentic diversity? Victims of harsh discrimination when they first came to the United States, as you just heard from Fred, Italian Americans faced issues including not speaking the language and having different skin color, contributing to stereotyping and insidious bias that persists. These differences became the object of jokes against Italian Americans and are apparent in the cultural history of the United States as seen in movies, television, and other media. Although Italian Americans are considered a protected class at CUNY, this fact is frequently met with snickering, laughter, direct jokes. Humor can be a helpful defense mechanism to cope with adversity or trauma. However, it is also a smokescreen for discrimination in the form of microaggression. The history of the Italian in American humor has from the beginning been both a source of solace and bigotry. Stereotypes were created allowing American humor to birth and foster a culture of discrimination against Italians. The subtlety of humor contributes to encourage prejudices against Italian Americans, whose place as an affirmative action group within CUNY remains fragile due to, in part, Italian Americans being viewed in the aggregate with white ethnics. It is not unusual for colleagues, including those in leadership roles, to make comments that indicate the depth of this prejudice and perpetuation of stereotypes. These microaggressions are defended as, "Hey, I was only joking." The basis for creating a protected class for Italian Americans and the need to now support that action with a vibrant curriculum in Italian American studies comes out of the discrimination, including the microaggressions and stereotyping that led to the initial declaration and then later legal decisions. In making the connections to stereotypes and who has the power to create these, there are levels of hegemonic control and privilege, so that within academe, some groups have widespread influence. An example is when scholars denigrate a particular area of study through humor. This was the situation that feminist studies, Black studies, and queer studies all faced in their origins. These are now accepted fields that constitute university departments, and the need for diverse curriculum has been stressed multiple times during this conference. Leadership can make a pronouncement about diversity and inclusion, but without the vigilance of oversight required in everyday discourse, those in positions of hegemonic control will continue to exclude studies in the areas of their derision and use jokes to veil their contempt. This is because the anti-categorical complexity of leadership impacts intersectionality. As long as those in authority do not immediately put a stop to verbal microaggressions in the form of humor, or worse, are the ones making the crude jokes, there will be no authentic diversity. To illustrate these points, 2 anecdotes. As a neophyte faculty member, I gave a provost lecture about research I was conducting in India about moral development. At the end of the lecture, a senior colleague congratulated me on the presentation and laughingly said, "You know, you're so smart. I just thought you were Jewish, not Italian." 20 years later, as a dean sitting at the college P&B, when discussing a recalcitrant faculty member, another dean said, "Well, you must have some mafia friends who can handle this for us." So, background 1. Freud's significant essay on humor, jokes, and their relations to the unconscious was published in 1905, and although flawed in some ways, bears careful re-examination. He argued that jokes are akin to dreams, and he makes a distinction between humor that is innocent and humor that is tendentious. The former are jokes often based on wordplay, such as puns. The latter, for Freud, represent desires seeking expression, predominantly expressions of aggression or sexuality. These permit the person to express inappropriate, repressed, or unconscious thoughts in the guise of only joking. As Michael Billig states, we want to believe that our humor is moral like ourselves, that we are innocently enjoying good jokes, which are just jokes. However, the sound of laughter has an aggressive cackle that permits momentary pleasure in unfeeling cruelty. As such, tendentious jokes are never merely just jokes. Background 2. Building on what Freud has said about the earlier images, World War II and the enemy aliens. The influence perceived stereotypes, which are presented as humorous, have tremendous effect on the future development of ethnic groups. Clearly, stereotyping of Italians and Italian Americans began long before World War II, yet the occupation of Sicily serves as a good example of how past experience and stereotyping of Italians created an ideology that exacerbated existing beliefs about Italian immigrants in the United States and about Sicilian immigrants in particular. A particular cartoon, as you can see here, by Edmund Duffy, shows you an American soldier coming to Sicily, and he says, "Good morning, pupil." And the Italians needed saving, according to the Americans, as opposed to the Germans and Japanese. Andrew Buchanan states, Washington's occupation policy in Italy stood in sharp contrast to the initial occupations of both Germany and Japan, where in Italy, American military government had an overtly punitive character. The cartoon is one of many examples that perpetuates the notion that Italians are inferior. The post-World War II era marks a change, where it was once seen as a racial difference, Italians as not white, shifted to an ethnic difference within the category of whiteness, where Italians remain toward the bottom of the hierarchy. Buchanan goes on to say that Americans of Italian heritage thus were seen as lazy, untrustworthy, superstitious, excitable, and of course, Catholic. They were represented as displaying an unstable dualism, combining cowardice and military incompetence with the cold-blooded violence attributed to organized crime. It is okay for someone in your ethnic group to tease you about something. However, this is not true for someone outside the group. Here, the use of the word is a primary example, as are most racial ethnic epithets. And just a note, teasing has its most serious impact among elementary and high school students. Childhood teasing has been linked to lower levels of self-esteem and later psychological consequences and mental disturbance. People with hostile attitudes toward a target group are most likely to enjoy the humor that is shown and just see it as harmless fun. Given that there is a psychological reality that exists separate from the social conditions, yet is influenced by them, what could be done to minimize stereotyped perceptions of Italian Americans and deprecating uses of humor, particularly in the academy? I mean, do understand that categorization is necessary given the vast amount of information that bombards us from moment to moment. The issue is, can we influence what information is selected by the individual in the creation of ethnic categorizations? This brings us back to the matter of leadership, taking immediate action to stifle such pernicious humor and let those present know it is not acceptable. It is also why ethnic studies curricula is critical to educating students away from their stereotyped characterizations. This means changing the context in which attitudes about Italian Americans are formed. It requires minimizing or eliminating contexts that lend to the self-fulfilling prophecy of stereotyping. Not an easy task given the pervasiveness of these contexts. It also requires leadership to model the behavior needed when humor is used to disparage a person's ethnicity. Hence, part of the stereotyping process, causing microaggressions that needs to be addressed by leadership and through education, is the casual use of humor about Italian Americans. To close, we need not venture outside CUNY. In response to learning that Italian Americans are a protected class, a CUNY doctoral student posted a message on Twitter that led to more than 100 responses. Just a few. Italian American discrimination, forget about it. Hey, that's one spicy meatball. It's true, I refused to eat the spicy meatball and I got expelled. Gonna stand outside the nearest CUNY and call everyone a Freddo and gabagool. These were all CUNY doctoral students. This helps to illustrate how humor, stereotypes, and prejudice are complicit bedfellows. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is talk briefly about what I consider the 7 components of I've dubbed a therapeutic and recuperative challenge to much of what we heard. While both Fred and Donna spoke about humor and about, let's say, the negative effects of humor, I think that we also have to realize that we do need to possess a bit of self-irony. And I just want to quote something that Fred wrote a number of years ago about what he called the disease of literalism. And he said that a recent site for observing this disease of literalism is in many of the responses of individual and organizations to such programs as The Sopranos. More unified acts by Italian Americans have been launched against fictional portrayals of the mafia than were ever mounted against the real mafiosi in the United States. Then he has another brief paragraph that follows. The complete opposite is true in Italy, where people have risked and lost their lives in pursuit of reality. So what is it about irony deficiency that leads to such behavior? And for me, that's an extremely important question, because what it speaks to is the lack of knowledge of history. And so what I see as these sort of 7 components are: 1, history; 2, acculturation versus assimilation; 3, representation, that is the representation of yesterday and today. We saw some of the really offensive examples from yesteryear, from 120 to 140 years ago, by both Fred and Donna. 4, the articulation of ethnicity; 5, identity; 6, interethnic collaboration; and 7, education. We internally really need to know our history. And I think that the fact that many Italian Americans do not know the history intimately, to the extent that perhaps they should when they decide to speak out publicly, perhaps never so more apparent than in what is going on today in the last few years around the discussions of Columbus. 2, articulation versus assimilation. We have always contended that if one wants to assimilate, so be it, and may he or she be happy on his or her way within the greater society mosaic that we call the United States of America. However, if one decides to acculturate, then they have other responsibilities, in the sense that they then move forward up this list of 7 components that I mentioned. So, for me, assimilation is, one just says, I'm American, and whether they eat spaghetti and meatballs on Sunday doesn't matter. They identify as American. They have no interest in any articulation, cultural, social, etc., that is, let's say, Italian within the greater context of Italian American, and that's fine. That's that individual's choice. However, if one acculturates, that is, wants, of course, becomes part of the fabric that is the United States, but also wants to identify with his or her cultural heritage, then that person has other responsibilities. In my opinion, that person needs to be aware of the representation of yesterday and today, of how that is articulated. That representation of the Italian then leads to the individual's greater ability, let's say, to articulate his or her ethnicity, in this case, Italian American. At that point, one arrives at a type of identity, a sense of identity as an Italian American, and with what some of us would consider to be the quote unquote proper amount, quote unquote, of knowledge to get to that point. Then there are 2 other components that are extremely important. One is interethnic collaboration, conversation, discussion. If we know our history very well and we interact with other ethnics, we can then be not just sympathetic, but empathetic to the plights of others. Number 7 is education, and the education that we acquire for ourselves, as well as what we do with that education, and how we then step out of the little world that is our Italian America, and we try to educate, let's say, society at large. Some of the things that Donna was talking about with regard to institutions, for example, are also related to this greater category that I call education. There is the necessity, I would submit to you, that the history of immigration in this country needs to be studied much more than it is. Think about all the history books, the civilization books, et cetera, that we all read in a junior high school and high school, even in elementary school, in perhaps the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. What did we learn about immigration? Little to none in my experience. And I grew up in an area that was very ethnic and very multi-ethnic, not just Italian American. So there is that issue of how the greater subject of immigration is inserted into let's say, the US curriculum. And then, of course, there was also the issue of where does Italian American studies stand within the greater discourse of ethnic studies. And that has become very problematic in our experience of trying to get Italian American studies into various graduate programs so that we can form those teachers, whether they're going to be high school teachers or college professors, to be able to deal with the issue of Italian Americana within that greater fabric. We at the Calandra Institute have tried to do various things. One, through our public programming, whether it's the lecture series that we have where scholars come and present their research, whether it's the book presentations, both creative and, let's say, scholarly writing, and as well as what we call docu-Italians, which is showings, presentations of documentaries, usually on Italians outside of Italy. And then the other thing we've done, we've developed what's called an Italian Diaspora Study Summer Seminar, open to advanced graduate students as well as to faculty members. We hold the program at the University of Roma Tre in Rome. And our, of course, ideal goal is that there should be at least one, if not more, Italian American study courses on each campus of the colleges around the City University of New York, especially since we are dealing with Italian Americans as a protected class that have been a protected class since 1976. So these are this very brief run through of this sort of therapeutic challenge that we have, a recuperative challenge that we have, and what we have attempted to do just in Luce, as I've tried to explain, I think is a starting point for us then have further collaborations with other institutions, but also to get things up and running in a much more efficient manner, let's say, within the City University of New York. You'll be able to see the entire session with Q&A on our Italics page at the URL below. Thanks for watching this episode of Italics. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata.